The blizzard hit the Rockies without warning, fierce as a wounded beast looking for a place to vent its rage. Inside the isolated log cabin perched precariously on the cliff face, Ethan Hale sat, motionless before the fireplace, twirling a glass of cheap whiskey but not drinking it. Ethan was 38, but the streaks of gray in his hair and the deep lines etched on his forehead made him look like he had lived 2 lives. The first life ended 6 years ago at a small school in Kabul, where he, a seasoned Navy SEAL, was too late to disarm the final mine. The explosion had robbed him of hearing in his left ear, but more devastatingly, it left the piercing cries of the children he couldn't save echoing in his mind. Since then, Ethan feared the sound of children crying more than death itself. He fled up here to this desolate, snow-covered wilderness, hoping the icy silence would bury his nightmares. Shadow, the old, 3-legged German shepherd, whose snout was resting on Ethan's boots, suddenly pricked up his scarred ears. He growled deep in his throat, the fur on his neck bristling, directed toward the front door. "Quiet, Shadow. It's just the wind," Ethan mumbled, his voice hoarse from long days of not speaking to anyone. But Shadow didn't quiet down. He barked wildly, scrambling toward the door and scratching frantically. Ethan frowned and put his whiskey glass down. Instinctively, he reached for the pistol tucked into his waistband and walked toward the door. The wooden door burst open, not by the wind, but by the impact of desperation. The snowstorm raged into the house like a 1,000-pound punch, bringing with it a biting chill of 20 degrees below zero. Ethan squinted, stunned. He had mentally prepared to face wolves, bears, or even lost smugglers, but he had never been trained to face this. A woman stood there, or rather, a staggering shadow about to collapse. Sarah, her face bloodless and pale, her lips cracked and blue, stood like a reed in the storm. She wore a bulky, old, snow-covered puffer coat. But what truly froze Ethan was what she was carrying. Clinging to her chest, fastened by an intricate military parachute cord wrapped tightly over her shoulders, were 3 tiny, weakly squirming bundles. They were so small they were swallowed by the fabric, like featherless hatchlings. Behind her, a frail girl of about 11, Mia, stumbled forward. She wasn't wearing gloves. Her red, swollen fingers were clutching a 4th small bundle pressed tightly against her thin chest, trying to impart her last bit of warmth to the tiny life within. Her eyes were wide, panicked yet strangely resilient. 4 newborn babies, and a screaming blizzard demanding their lives. Ethan stood rooted to the spot, the gun in his hand slowly dropping. Memories flooded back, the cries in his head deafening. He wanted to slam the door shut, to turn his back on this trouble. "Please," Sarah whispered. Her voice fractured like cracking ice, pulling him back to reality. She didn't look at the gun. She looked into his eyes, the eyes of a mother ready to trade her life for a chance for her children. "They are premature. They need warmth." 37 degrees. Then she collapsed. Her body crumpled onto the cold wooden floor. Instinctively, Ethan lunged forward, catching her before she hit the door frame, his other arm wrapping around the fabric bundle on her chest to prevent the babies from being shaken. "Mia, get inside fast," he yelled above the wind, pulling the shivering group inside, slamming the door shut and locking the bolt. The room was suddenly warm, but the atmosphere was taut. Ethan laid Sarah down on the rug in front of the fireplace. With trembling hands, he unwrapped the parachute cord. 3 infants, red-skinned, wrinkled, and thin as tissue paper, were struggling to breathe. They weren't crying, a terrible sign. They were too weak to cry. Mia also collapsed beside him, still clutching the 4th baby tightly. She looked at Ethan, her teeth chattering. "Mister, the baby isn't moving anymore." Ethan shivered. Tonight, the house of a man running from his past had suddenly become the most brutal battlefield for life he had ever participated in. The next 3 days were a nonstop campaign, not on a smoky battlefield, but in a cramped living room reeking of milk and anxiety. As Ethan predicted, The storm had knocked out the substation at the foot of the mountain. Worse, his old generator, after a few coughs, breathed its last on the very first night. Darkness and cold seeped into every wooden crack. The temperature inside plummeted. The premature babies, each weighing less than 2 kilograms, who should have been in hospital incubators, began to turn blue. Their bodies lacked the fat layer needed to retain heat. The wood stove, though Ethan constantly fed it with pine wood, couldn't spread enough warmth against the sub-zero temperature. Sarah had woken from her faint due to exhaustion, but she was too weak to care for all 4 babies. She sat propped against the sofa, her dark-ringed eyes watching her children slowly fade. As a midwife, she knew exactly what was coming. Hypothermia leading to respiratory failure and cardiac arrest. "They're too cold," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Lucas and Leo, the weakest ones, their breathing is slowing." Ethan looked at the 2 tiny boys, their chests weakly fluttering like dying. Butterfly wings. He looked at Sarah, then down at his own rough, calloused hands that had pulled triggers and wielded daggers. Could these hands save anyone? He stood up, decisively throwing 2 large oak logs into the fire. "Take your clothes off," Ethan ordered, his voice gruff, devoid of any ill intent. Sarah looked up, bewildered. "Kangaroo care," Ethan said curtly, recalling a military first aid course. "Skin to skin. It's the only way now. The adult body is the best incubator." Without waiting for her reaction, he sat on the floor, leaning his back against the sofa right next to the fireplace. He stripped off his thick sweater and the t-shirt underneath, revealing a muscular, rugged chest crisscrossed with jagged scars, the remnants of bullets, knives, and shrapnel. "Give me the 2 weakest ones," he instructed. Sarah understood. She, trembling, unwrapped the blankets around Lucas and Leo, leaving only their thin diapers, then carefully placed the 2 tiny beings directly onto Ethan's bare skin. Ethan's first sensation was the bone-chilling cold emanating from the infant's skin, followed by a shocking softness. They were so small, so fragile. He held his breath, fearing his chest movements would hurt them. Sarah also shed her coat, holding the remaining 2 girls tightly against her own skin. Mia, the resilient girl, was wrapped in 2 layers of down blankets and tasked with a crucial duty, constantly feeding the fire and heating water on the stovetop to prepare formula. Ethan and Sarah sat there, forming 2 living incubators. Ethan took a large wool blanket and covered himself and the 2 babies completely, leaving only their tiny faces exposed for air. That's how they sat for 12 hours that night, sleepless, daring not to move too much. The cold outside howled as if trying to rip the roof off, but beneath the old wool blanket was another world. A world of warmth, heartbeats, and fragile life. In the flickering firelight, Sarah secretly watched the stranger beside her. Ethan had his eyes closed, his chin gently resting on the crown of baby Leo's sparse hair. His face looked less fierce in sleep, though the long scar running from his temple down his cheek still commanded caution. Sarah sighed softly. She recalled the horrific night at the clandestine clinic. The billionaire had ordered the disposal of these surplus babies like medical waste. She hadn't thought. She just grabbed them and ran. She wasn't their biological mother, but the moment she held them, her destiny was tied to these 4 lives. And now, that destiny rested on the chest of a strange man. "Have you ever been a father?" Sarah asked softly, breaking the stifling silence. Ethan didn't open his eyes, just slightly shook his head, his deep voice vibrating through his chest, sending tremors through the 2 infants. "No, I'm only used to taking lives, not nurturing them." The bitter answer stung Sarah's heart. She looked at the scars on his body. Some were from metal, but there were also invisible scars in his soul that she felt through the deep solitude that enveloped this house. Sarah reached out from under the blanket, adjusting the corner that had slipped from Ethan's bare shoulder. Her finger inadvertently brushed against the star-shaped keloid scar on his bicep. A sniper's bullet mark. Ethan flinched slightly, but he didn't push her away. "The children don't think so," she said, her voice surprisingly warm, her gaze tenderly fixed on Lucas, who was sleeping peacefully on the soldier's chest. Your heartbeat is very slow, very steady. Doctors say preemies need stability, a sense of security. You're their anchor, Ethan. You are saving their lives with your very heart. Ethan slowly opened his eyes. He looked down. The two tiny lives clung to his chest like little newts finding a warm rock after the rain. Baby Leo's small hand was clutching a hair. On his chest, the tiny fingers no bigger than peas. For the first time in 6 years, the clamor of explosions in his mind fell silent. In its place was the steady, gentle breathing of infants. A strange feeling crept into his heart, hot, aching, yet profoundly peaceful. He realized his hand wasn't just made for pulling a trigger. It was wide enough to shelter a small world. Get some sleep, Ethan said, his voice much less harsh. I'll watch the fire. Mia, give me the bottle. This little guy is starting to fuss for food. Sarah smiled, a weak but hope-filled smile. Amidst the blizzard and the darkness, in this humble log cabin, something more sacred than love was blooming. It was the camaraderie between people sharing the same trenches of life and death. Day 4. The frantic blizzard outside finally calmed down, but the meter-deep layer of snow completely blocked the exit, turning Ethan's cabin into an isolated island in a wide ocean. But inside that island, a revolution had taken place. The gloomy, icy silence that had reigned for the past 3 years was unceremoniously evicted. In its place was a chaotic, warm, and formula-scented mess. The bachelor's kitchen, which previously only smelled of bitter coffee and cheap whiskey, had now transformed into a forward command post. The rough oak countertop was lined with bottles, formula canisters, muslin cloths, and warm water. Ethan Hale, the man who could disarm a complex C4 mine in the dark with unshaking hands, was now frozen in concentration before a 60 milliliters plastic bottle. Sweat beaded on his forehead. His large, calloused hands, with rough fingers that once gripped a sniper rifle trigger, were awkwardly holding a tiny, light pink plastic scoop. One scoop. Leveled off, Ethan muttered like a mantra, his eyes narrowed with intense focus. He was afraid of scooping too much and causing constipation, or scooping too little and leaving them hungry. For Ethan, this was more stressful than calculating artillery coordinates. Wrong, Sergeant. A clear voice rang out, accompanied by a light, breezy chuckle. Sarah had appeared behind him without him noticing. She had washed and was wearing one of his oversized checked flannel shirts. It reached her knees, and the sleeves were rolled up multiple times. Her damp chestnut hair was loosely tied at the nape of her neck, with a few strands framing her delicate forehead. She didn't hesitate to step closer, closing the distance between them to 0. She took his wrist, her small, soft, yet scratched hand was completely engulfed in his powerful one. You're shaking, Sarah teased, her warm breath fanning his neck. 30 milliliters of water, 1 leveled scoop. Don't press the powder down. Just level it gently. Like this. She guided his hand, expertly performing the leveling motion. They were so close that Ethan could smell the rich, sweet scent of formula mixed with her natural fragrance, a light scent like summer rain, a smell he thought he had long forgotten in this dry, snowy mountain region. Ethan's muscles tensed in a defensive reflex, but he didn't move away. He stood still as a wooden statue, feeling a strange warmth spreading across his chest. Are you giving me orders? He grumbled, trying to maintain his usual scowl, but failing miserably as a corner of his mouth automatically curled up. Sarah looked up at him. Her honey-brown eyes, which had been full of anxiety and fear these past few days, now held a rare, playful spark. Someone has to, she retorted, completely unafraid of this massive bear. You might be the king of this mountain, Ethan, but in this diaper and formula kitchen, I'm the general. And you're just a private in training. Ethan let out a deep, rumbling laugh, a sound that even he found unfamiliar. All right, General, what's the next directive? Sarah released his hand, patting his shoulder gently, her gaze softening with deep gratitude. The directive is change baby Leo's diaper. The little guy had another blowout. And remember to be gentle. Don't wrap it like a tourniquet. Ethan sighed dramatically, picking up a clean cloth diaper. Understood. Biological ordnance disposal mission. Let's go. At noon, weak sunlight penetrated the icy film on the window, casting pale streaks of light onto the floor. The scene in the living room was such that if Ethan's former teammates saw it, they would surely think he had been kidnapped and brainwashed. Shadow, the fierce service dog that once tore the arm of a terrorist in Kandahar, was now lying flat on a sheepskin rug. The four tiny dumplings, Lucas, Leo, and the two girls, whom Sarah had temporarily named Luna and Layla, were sprawling and crawling around his belly. Shadow lay perfectly still, his amber eyes half closed in a look of resigned endurance, his stumpy tail occasionally thumping softly against the floor to soothe any fussing baby. Mia, the 11-year-old girl with large, old beyond her years eyes, was sitting nearby, folding tiny infant clothes that Ethan had pulled out of his late wife's keepsake chest. Uncle Ethan, Mia called, her voice less shaky now, replaced by absolute trust. Does Shadow buy babies? Ethan, sitting in the old armchair with a thick book in hand, looked up. Him? No. Shadow only bites bad guys. With kids, he's just a living, breathing hot water bottle. Mia giggled. The girl's clear laughter brightened the room more than the fire in the hearth. Sarah, sitting opposite, sewing up Mia's torn coat, looked up at her sister, smiling. Her eyes were red-rimmed. How long had it been since Mia laughed like that? Since their parents died? And the two sisters were drawn into the cycle of survival. Then the escape from the surrogacy ring. Mia had to grow up too fast. Keep reading, Sarah said softly, her voice like velvet. The baby's like your voice. It's deep and steady like white noise that helps him sleep. Ethan looked at the book in his hand. There were no fairy tales in this house. No Little Red Riding Hood. Or Snow White. The only books he had were military documents and survival guides. He cleared his throat and began to read aloud. Chapter 4. Water Sourcing Techniques and Shelter Construction. His voice boomed, deep and firm. The first rule, never panic. When lost in the jungle, water is more important than food. Look for succulent vines. It was a bizarre and humorous sight. A scar man was reading a book on survival in the Amazon to 4 infants less than a week old and a little girl folding diapers. But strangely, no one was bored. The babies seemed genuinely hypnotized by his deep, masculine voice. Baby Lucas smacked his lips and drifted off to sleep. Baby Luna also closed her eyes. And that's how you find fresh water from roots and how to determine direction by the moss growing on tree trunks. Ethan finished the chapter, closed the book, and looked down. The room fell silent. Only the cheerful crackling of the firewood remained. Ethan looked to his side. His heart skipped a beat. Sarah had fallen asleep. She was sitting on the floor, right next to the leg of his armchair, her head resting fully on his thigh. Her brown hair was spread across Ethan's worn jeans. She was sleeping soundly, her breathing regular, her face relaxed, shedding all her usual vigilance and worries. This was perhaps the most peaceful sleep she'd had in months. One of her arms rested loosely on the floor. The other was placed gently on his knee. And what made Ethan hold his breath, not daring to move even a millimeter, was her little finger. That tiny pinky was unconsciously hooked into the pinky of his left hand, the hand hanging down the side of the chair. An unconscious pinky lock, a connection more fragile yet, more enduring than any iron chain. Ethan sat still as stone. He was afraid if he exhaled too loudly, this moment would vanish like a mirage. He leaned down to look at Sarah's face. At this proximity, he clearly saw the dark circles under her eyes, the faint freckles dusting her nose, and the tiny scar near the corner of her mouth, perhaps the trace of a fall in the painful past she hadn't yet shared. His past was about bombs and the regret of failing to save his wife and child. Hers was about fleeing and the burden of protecting her sister and children not of her blood. Two wounded souls, abandoned by the world, now relying on each other in a log cabin amidst a blizzard. Ethan gently, carefully, used his thumb to lightly stroke the back of Sarah's hand. Her skin was slightly rough from the elements, but incredibly warm. The light touch sent a current down his spine, awakening the buried desire for love beneath the permafrost of his heart. He looked at the four sleeping babies. Around Shadow, he looked at Mia curled up in a blanket on the opposite sofa. And he looked at the woman leaning on his thigh as if she had found the most peaceful harbor in her life. In that moment, the old soldier's icy heart completely melted. He realized he no longer wanted solitude. He didn't want to return to evenings of drinking alone and staring at his ex-wife's photo with gnawing grief. He wanted this chaos. He wanted the midnight wails. He wanted to hear Sarah's voice directing him in the kitchen, wanted her to scold him for mixing the formula wrong, wanted to see Mia giggle when he told military stories. He wanted this sweet, heavy burden on his shoulders forever. "Sleep well, General," Ethan whispered, his voice low, only loud enough for himself to hear. He gently squeezed, his pinky finger around hers, responding to the unconscious clasp. Outside the window, the wind began to howl in bursts, signaling a new cold front. But this time, Ethan was no longer cold. He knew that even if the storm broke tomorrow, even if the hunters found their way to the door, he would never let anyone destroy this peaceful scene, because he had found his new mission in life. And Soldier Ethan Hale had never failed when he truly wanted to protect something. But Ethan did not yet know that this peace was only the calm before a bigger storm. A storm that carried not snow, but the law, power, and human cruelty, silently creeping closer, waiting to tear apart the fragile sanctuary he had just begun to dream of. Day 5. The morning sun barely managed to pierce the gray clouds to touch the roof when a strange and terrifying sound tore through the quiet sky of the Rockies. It wasn't the wind howling, nor the wolves baying. It was the mechanical roar of an engine, thundering right above their heads. The helicopter blades sliced the air, creating a man-made storm that churned up snow around the cabin, obscuring the sunlight. The house vibrated violently, and sawdust drifted from the ceiling. Inside, Shadow barked furiously, rushing to the window to bare his teeth and growl. The four sleeping babies jolted awake and began wailing simultaneously. A chorus of panic. Sarah, who was folding diapers by the table, turned chalk white. She dropped the stack of diapers, her eyes wide as she stared out the snow-dusted window. "It's them," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling so violently her teeth chattered. "The corporation's people. They found me. They're here." Ethan was standing by the stove, holding pliers to adjust a cupboard hinge. He dropped the pliers. The sound of metal hitting the wooden table was jarring. He quickly moved to the window, opening a tiny gap to look out. A sleek black helicopter, unmarked, was landing in the clearing about 50 yards from the house, where the snow had been partially blown away by the wind. The cabin door opened. 3 men stepped out. The 2 men behind wore black, armed with short submachine guns concealed beneath their thick coats, moving with the gait of professionals. Leading them was a man in his 50s, wearing an expensive suit under a luxurious trench coat, carrying a leather briefcase in one hand and a thick file in the other. He walked across the snow with an air of disdain, as if the very presence of dirt here was staining his polished leather shoes. "They've come to dispose of the defective product and take me back," Sarah said, tears welling up. She rushed to the makeshift crib by the fireplace, clumsily trying to pick up the children. "I have to go. I have to take them into the woods. Leo and Lucas. They'll kill them for being underweight." Ethan turned around, seeing the young mother's utter terror. She was losing control. She was about to run out into the sub-zero temperature with 4 frail infants, just to escape an invisible but real fear. He walked up, firmly gripping her shoulders, holding her in place. "You can't outrun a helicopter with 4 newborns, Sarah," he shouted, his voice sharp to cut through the deafening engine noise outside. "If you go out there, They'll die of cold before those men even catch you. But I can't let them take the children. Sarah screamed, struggling in his grip. The memory of the surrogate mother's death, of the billionaire's cold gaze ordering the cull, choked her. You don't understand, Ethan. To them, these aren't people. They are assets. Defective merchandise. They will discard Lucas and Leo like trash. Ethan tightened his grip on her shoulders, then spun her around, forcing her to look him in the eye. The former soldier's gray eyes were no longer sorrowful or tired. They blazed with a steadfast fire, solid as ancient mountain rock. His large, rough hand cupped her cheek, his callous thumb gently wiping away the hot tears streaming down her face. Look at me, Sarah, he said, his voice dropping, slow and deliberate. You trusted me with their lives during that deadly blizzard. Now, trust me one more time. As long as I'm standing here, no one is allowed to take my family anywhere. The word family came out his mouth so naturally that both were momentarily stunned. It wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was a statement forged in. The sleepless nights spent warming the babies, in the smell of formula lingering on his shirt, in the unconscious clasp of hands last night. Sarah stopped struggling. She looked deep into his eyes, finding there an absolute guarantee. She nodded, though tears continued to fall. Ethan released her. He turned and walked toward the gun rack on the wall. He reached for the double-barrel shotgun. Sarah held her breath, but then he put it down. He knew using a weapon now would be foolish. A shootout would only endanger the children, and he would become a killer, permanently losing the right to protect them. Instead, he opened a drawer, took out a stack of old property deeds and his honorable discharge certificate. He adjusted his shirt collar, inhaling a deep breath of cold air and baby formula scent. Lock the door. Keep shadow inside. Cover the baby's ears if you can, Ethan commanded curtly. He opened the door and stepped outside, confronting the artificial storm and the wolves. In suits, the wind from the helicopter blades stung Ethan's face. He stood blocking the steps, feet spread wide, arms crossed, looming like a mountain across their path. The man in the suit and the two bodyguards stopped 10 meters away. The lawyer squinted at the disheveled man before him, smirking contemptuously. He pulled a red-stamped document from his briefcase. Ethan Hale, is that correct? The lawyer shouted over the noise. We are here to recover stolen property. The nurse named Sarah Brennan, hiding in your house, committed the act of kidnapping 4 embryos that are the intellectual and biological property of my client. Property. Intellectual property. Those cold, dehumanizing words made Ethan's blood boil. But his face remained impassive. There is no property. Here, Ethan said, his voice deep and resonant, cutting through the wind's shriek, colder than the snow beneath their feet. There are only my wife and my children in my house. The lawyer laughed. A bitter, mocking sound. Wife? Children? Don't joke, my friend. I know your file by heart. A retired SEAL veteran with PTSD, living alone, an alcoholic, deeply in debt, and socially isolated. Who are you trying to fool? He waved his hand, and the 2 bodyguards stepped forward, hands resting on the grips of the guns beneath their coats. Ethan did not back down. He looked directly into the lawyer's eyes, his gaze sharp as a dagger. We held a local customary engagement ceremony under mountain law just before the storm hit. Ethan lied without blinking, his confident and authoritative demeanor making the lawyer pause. And according to Colorado State's safe haven law, if I take an abandoned children on my doorstep during a blizzard and declare protective custody, I am their temporary legal guardian until a formal federal court ruling. He held up the stack of papers in his hand. This is private land. Anyone who crosses this fence line without a warrant from Sheriff Miller will be considered trespassing and threatening the lives of my family. And believe me, your private company scraps of paper hold no value in this godforsaken region. The lawyer gritted his teeth. He knew Ethan was bluffing about the law, but the veteran's confidence made him hesitate. He didn't want a scandal. He wanted a quiet resolution. You dare to defy us? The man spat. Do you know who my client is? He could buy this entire mountain and bury you under it. He signaled. The 2 bodyguards drew their weapons, pointing them straight at Ethan. This was it, the moment of truth. Ethan didn't flinch. His right hand slowly moved to his belt, a deliberate, menacing movement. He pulled the safety pin from a round object clipped to his belt, a rough green M67 fragmentation grenade. Click. The sound of the grenade pin snapping out was dry, small, yet carried the weight of 1,000 tons in the tense air. The lawyer's face went white. The two bodyguards froze, their gun barrels instinctively dropping slightly. It was a keepsake Ethan had kept from the battlefield. The explosives had been removed, and the fuse was deactivated 10 years ago. It was just a harmless piece of metal used as a paperweight. But they didn't know that. In their eyes, Ethan was a crazy, PTSD-afflicted veteran with nothing left to lose. And a man with nothing to lose would dare anything. Take one more step. Ethan roared, his voice echoing through the valley, overpowering the helicopter's noise, his eyes flashing with a wild, primal look. And I'll show you why I was discharged. I have nothing to lose, but I swear to God, I will die defending this door. Want to test who's crazier? He raised the grenade high, his thumb lightly pressing the spoon, and took a step toward them. The madness in Ethan's eyes was real. It wasn't an act. It was the look of an old, scarred alpha wolf, ready to tear apart anyone who dared touch the vulnerable pups behind him. The lawyer backed away. Cold sweat broke out on his forehead despite the sub-zero temperature. He was a businessman. He calculated profit and risk. An explosion, 3 bodies, federal police involvement, the media jumping in. The risk was too great for 4 embryos. All right, the lawyer stammered, raising his hands. Calm down. My friend, we're going. We're leaving now. He signaled for the 2 bodyguards to retreat, then turned and ran back to the helicopter as if chased by a ghost. The door slammed shut. The helicopter quickly lifted off, leaving a blinding cloud of snow before disappearing behind the mountain range. When the sound of the helicopter completely faded, returning the high mountain region to its natural silence, Ethan finally relaxed his body. His legs gave way. The pain from old injuries and the sudden drop in adrenaline made him dizzy. He sat heavily on the steps, still clutching the useless grenade, breathing heavily. The front door burst open. Sarah rushed out, without pausing to grab a warm coat. She ran to him, kneeling down and wrapping her arms around his shoulders. "You're insane," she sobbed, tears pouring down her face, hitting his chest with muffled fists. "You threatened them with that toy grenade? What if they had shot you? You idiot! Idiot!" Ethan let out a rough laugh, a sound like gravel crunching in his throat. He dropped the useless grenade onto the wooden floor and grabbed the hand that was hitting his chest. "It worked," he said, his voice soft. "At least, we chased the vultures away." He looked up at her. Sarah's face was tear-streaked, her hair disheveled. But in his eyes, she had never been more beautiful. The beauty of survival, of fierce love. Shadow also ran out from inside, barked happily, and licked Ethan's face. Mia stood peeking from the doorway, holding baby Lucas, looking at Uncle Ethan with the admiration one reserves for a superhero. Ethan took a deep breath, tried to regulate his heartbeat. He knew this victory was only temporary. "Sarah," he said, his voice becoming serious again, pulling her down to sit beside him on the cold steps. "Listen to me. They will come back. Next time, it won't be private security. It will be a real court order, the county sheriff, the best lawyers in the state. My lie about the engagement and the safe haven law, it will be exposed in a heartbeat." Sarah wiped her tears, and fear rose again in her eyes. "Then what should we do? Where should I take the children now? I can't let you get involved anymore." "No one is going anywhere," Ethan interrupted her. He turned, facing her. Ethan knelt on one knee on the wooden floor, right in the middle of the slushy melted snow. His action stunned Sarah. He reached up to his neck and took off the metal chain he was wearing. It was a pair of old, worn military dog tags, engraved with his name, blood type, and religion. It was his most valuable possession, his honor, his past, everything that defined him for the last 38 years. "Let's turn the lie into the truth," Ethan said, his voice deep, sincere to the point of breaking her heart. He took Sarah's hand and placed the cold dog tags into her warm palm. I don't have a diamond ring. I don't know how to say flowery words or be a romantic husband. I'm crude. I'm grumpy. I snore loudly when I sleep, and I have nightmares about the war. Ethan confessed, his voice slightly shaky. But I can mix formula to exactly 37 degrees. I can keep Lucas and Leo warm when it's cold. I can teach Mia how to protect herself. And I swear, I can take a bullet for you and the kids. He looked deep into her eyes, a gaze filled with boundless compassion. Sarah, give me a status to legally protect you and the children. Let me be the father of these 4 little ones, the brother of Mia and your husband. Will you marry this washed-up old soldier? Sarah looked at the dog tags in her hand. They didn't sparkle like gold or silver, but they held the heavy weight of a life-or-death promise. She looked at the man kneeling before her, the man who opened his door in the blizzard, who stripped his shirt to warm children who were not his own, the man who was just ready to die defending his doorstep. She had spent her whole life running, searching for safety. And now, that safety was kneeling before her, begging to shelter her. Sarah burst into tears, but this time they were tears of overwhelming joy. She knelt with him, hugging his neck, burying her face in the sturdy hollow of his shoulder, smelling of gunpowder and pine wood. Yes, she whispered through her tears. Ido, Sergeant, Ido. Ethan wrapped his arms tightly around her, lifting her up and spinning her around in the white snow. Shadow barked joyfully, running in circles around them. Mia stood by the door, giggling, waving at the 2 infants inside as if to say, "We have a father." In the corner of the room, the 4 babies simultaneously stirred and began to cry loudly for food. Their cries were sharp and full of life, scattering the mountain's solitude. Ethan set Sarah down, kissed her forehead lightly, and sighed happily, a radiant smile spreading across his scarred face. All right, my love. Romantic time is over. Time for operations. Squad leader Lucas is hungry again. He took her hand, and together they stepped into the house, closing the wooden door. The storm had passed outside, but the warm flame inside this log cabin would never go out. Life sometimes throws the coldest blizzards at us, so that we realize true warmth does not come from a hearth, but from the synchronized beating of hearts willing to sacrifice for one another.